Hello and welcome to session 7 of You Matter. Where I am very pleased to be talking to fellow physiotherapist Alistair Beverley on the perhaps slightly surprising subject of banter. This is a subject that came about due to Alistair and I getting to know each other a bit better through the build-up to Therapy Live, the main Therapy Live conference back in June, where we experienced quite a lot of banter on a certain WhatsApp group. And I'll explain more when we get into the body of the podcast. But it was something that made me thoughtful and made me contact Alistair afterwards, see what his thoughts were. And it transpired that there was quite a lot behind the subject of banter in terms of comfort levels with it, what it actually is, what it means about human interaction, whether or not it's professional, whether it's appropriate in our professional environments. And the discussion that came about during this podcast didn't disappoint. I had a suspicion it would open up some interesting topic areas for discussion, and it really did deliver on that. So I hope you enjoy us picking our way through the ins and outs, the positives and negatives, the benefits and the downsides of banter. As usual, if you enjoyed the session, then please do give us a rating on, if you're listening on YouTube, and you can give us a 5-star rating. That would be absolutely lovely. Thank you. That helps to boost things up the league tables. And I will be back at the end of the session to give you a bit of a roundup. Hello, so I am delighted to be welcoming to this episode Alistair Beverley, who has become a great friend. Alistair is a physiotherapist, fellow physiotherapist specialising in learning disabilities, and he's very kindly come on to talk to me about the subject of banter. But Alistair, before we get into the nuts and bolts of that and why we decided to talk about that subject, could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. So hi, everybody. My name is Alistair Beverley. I am a physiotherapist, qualified in 2010 from Sheffield Hallam University. Spent a couple of years working in the NHS in community services, and then worked for a private organisation in a day service for people with quite complex needs, and now work at Portland College, which is a college for people with additional physical and/or learning disabilities. I also moonlight as a physiotherapist for Special Olympics Great Britain. Now, the Special Olympics is quite about an explanation in this introduction. I do apologise and don't want to take up the entire hour. No, but the Special Olympics differs from the things that are going on right now, which is the Paralympics. Special Olympics is just people who have a learning disability, whereas the Paralympics pertain to people who have all sorts of registered disabilities, of which there is a category for learning disabilities. So yeah, I've been lucky enough to be the physiotherapist at 3 of the World Games for Team GB in Los Angeles, Abu Dhabi and Austria for the Winter Games. And I also head up health screening for Special Olympics Great Britain. They run free health screening events at national and international events by physios, podiatrists, optometrists, audiologists, dentists, psychologists. I always miss one and I get shouted at. But the idea is that we try and redress the health inequality that people with learning disabilities experience via free screening, training up of local volunteers, and referral into healthcare services. So I coordinate the Great Britain side of that. I'm also set up this thing on social media as the LD Physio, and that was around trying to improve understanding of healthcare practitioners on the needs of people with learning disabilities. And that's how Jo and I think of, we've come across each other on social medias and through our work with the Therapy Live guys. And I think that's probably led us to where we are today.
Oh, I learned quite a bit about you there, Alistair. I didn't know anything about the Special Olympics. I knew you'd been involved in sport in the past. I guess that's a really nice way to marry the two worlds.
Yeah.
And I don't want to insult other therapists working in learning disabilities, but Alistair has really become consciously vocal. Would that be fair to say, to try and
I think that was a real big step for me, to be honest, because I think as you know, Joe, I've spoken to you at length about the imposter syndrome over the years, and but I just fed up watching people struggle with the system, including my own family. My brother had Down syndrome, and I thought I need to get over myself to be able to affect change, and I didn't see anybody else at that point, and still don't really, talking about the need for change and advocating for the needs of people with learning disabilities. So I wanted to add my broad, plain speaking northern dulcet tones to the melting pot, as it were.
And doing a really, really good job. Long may it continue.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I guess communication is behind this whole subject, banter, isn't it? And if I just give a little bit of context to this podcast topic, which might on the face of it seem an unusual one, particularly for this You Matter podcast, perhaps. So one of the areas where Alistair and I have encountered each other, I suppose, is in the build-up to the last Therapy Live conference. And because that was the largest conference, there was a load of moderators recruited and required for that event. And a WhatsApp group was set up to help us support each other, to share knowledge and resources to make sure that we were all prepped well for that event, which I have to say we were, that was achieved extremely well. But and one of the things I was intrigued about was the nature of the conversation on that WhatsApp group. So I would say that as a physiotherapist, banter is not a new way of communicating for me in a professional sense, probably more interprofessionally rather than with clients. And I would say that I enjoy it on a level. I am happy to engage in it. But this was kind of like banter 10 levels up to anything I'd experienced before. And Alistair, I'll hand over to you in a minute and ask you whether that was the case or if it just felt completely normal and comfortable. But I kind of watched it smiling, occasionally agog as to how far it would go. And I went on a bit of a journey with it, which I won't preempt now because I think it'll be drawn out in the conversation. But Alistair, what was your experience in that particular context?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. And I think there was, a banterous tone to that group, certainly in terms of, jibes and playful sort of, comments towards each other. And I think there were people in that group who knew each other very well. I, at the point, wasn't necessarily one of them. I could probably name that. I've only met, I think, 2 of them in person, and there were quite a few that I've heard of and read articles about and seen on social media, but not actually engaged with. So I think it was quite tricky it wasn't tricky, no, it was quite interesting, is probably the better phrase, to be thrown into that melting pot and the early sort of. There were some people who tried to sort of set the tone of how they wanted to engage on the group quite quickly, and some people who just sort of sat back a little bit and just to see how things warmed up. But ultimately, I think one of the things that you mentioned before, Joe, is I think that banterous nature and that being able to not take ourselves too seriously helped us to pull together. In times of need. My background, I'm a rugby player by trade as well. So hashtag Bants is, I want to say, goes with the territory, both in men's and women's rugby. It's probably quite well known for that kind of banter and I don't know, I use the phrase laddish. And again, I don't think it's gender specific because I know that some of the women's teams are just as bad, if not in some instances worse. But yeah, that wasn't necessarily new to me. I think for me, I'm somebody who I like to see myself as somebody who can adapt my communication style to any given situation. And if I get something wrong, I see that as something that I've necessarily got wrong, or maybe that's part of me internalizing things a little bit more. But so I wasn't quite as, maybe not quite so taken back by the level, but I sort of assumed that the people who were bantering with each other harder, for want of a better phrase, and again, it's not the right word I'm sure of a better word to use, were people that knew each other better. And I certainly was happier to poke fun at Jack March, for example. Partly because he was really stressed, but partly because I think I've got a good working relationship with Jack, rather than, say, Leanne Antoine, for example.
Who, as it turns out, can banter
Indeed,
with the best of them.
Indeed, yes. And there are people in there that I've sort of come out of, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you're the banter king or queen. Yes, we will. I'll bear that one in mind. Jem Oliver strikes
Yes,
definitely stuck to mind.
Yeah, and I think what you alluded to there is might sound a bit of a heavy word, but almost a level of consent. So just literally coming on before the podcast, I thought, just out of my own interest, I will Google the etymology, or the definition rather, of banter. And first definition I came up with was the playful and friendly exchange of teasing remarks. There was much good-natured banter. And for the most part, I think, as you said, consent between individuals who are in professions that require them to be skilled and flexible communicators, that consent isn't likely to be a huge issue. But there are boundaries, aren't there? And the difficulty is when you enter into that, particularly in a group like that where you don't know people, and unless you all had a contract to start with, which frankly would kill banter, it's quite a tricky minefield to tread through, isn't it?
Certainly. And I think, when it comes to that nature, that's why my sort of approach is kind of, okay, let's just sort of take stock of the situation, take stock of the playing field before, adapting accordingly. But I think, like you say, it's the implied consent that's there. The challenge, and I think sometimes when banter is received wrong, is when people don't read the signs, or people are very good at masking their unhappiness, but their desire to try and fit in with a given situation means that they are genuinely mortally offended, or taking things ways that apparently weren't intended, but are unable to communicate that, or don't feel themselves in a group or a situation where they're comfortable to express that.
Yeah, no, I'd like to. I'll circle back in a moment and sort of I want to make this a balanced discussion about the upsides and the downsides. But just to complete my intro and perhaps move on from that group example, I was definitely someone who sort of warmed into that group over time. But most people that were there on the day as participants, attendees, or people delivering sessions or moderating will know that the first couple of hours were a pretty stressful situation of trying to manage the server going down in America. And I think what overwhelmed me there was the instant level of support from that specific moderator group, absolutely unquestioning, considering what we've just said about how little we knew each other before. It was absolutely right. Who needs what? Where can I be? What can I wing to just come and cover what needs covering? We can do this. Come on, keep our heads up. Let's go. And I reflected at the time and afterwards that I think the banter was actually part of that, because there's a certain robustness about that type of conversation, and an agreement between us that, no, okay, we're going to get this job done. There'll be time to reflect and be perhaps more introspective afterwards, but at the moment we just got to get on with this. So and I think it certainly wasn't exclusively the banter, because don't get me wrong, there were some really supportive messages on that WhatsApp group as well. It was a good mix, but I had to conclude that whatever my thoughts about banter in its extreme on that day, in that moment, in those couple of hours, I think it was part of the success.
Completely. And I'm just reflecting as you're speaking there on sort of team building exercises. Obviously this is a team that's been thrown together throughout various lockdowns and during the pandemic. And, if you look at, high level, again, I'm going back to sports, but high level sports teams, or, even high level teams in the business world, they will take time out to go and do team building activities. That is a challenge in a virtual world.
Yeah.
And potentially you could see that the sort of the playful nature of the group at the beginning was was that sort of, the team, that team building, and trying to test the waters of each other, and then I reflect on the British Lions who've just come back from their tour in South Africa. They go away for sort of 4 or 5 days, and they just engage with team building activities, and a lot of that is based around physical activities, task challenges, but there's a lot of humor in there. There's a lot of fun, and I think potentially that could have been an unconscious thing, that we were trying to do that, or do the best way of trying to find each other out and trying to find each other who we were as people, given the constraints of not being able to meet physically.
Yeah, I think you're right. And obviously none of us could have seen, and certainly wouldn't have wished for, what happened in those first couple of hours. But yeah, it's almost like we're saying we were creating the blueprint for disaster management, not knowing that we were going to have to deploy it.
It's interesting. Well, do you think that just to jump back in, do you think we'd have been able to, support each other in the way that we were, in terms of jumping in and out of the back end of, or trying to jump in and out of the back end of Therapy Live, if we potentially had kept things very, I don't know what the alternative to banter is, but some people would say professional, but I think that's another thing that we can pick apart, is where the banter is unprofessional or not. But keeping it on the level, for want of a better phrase, do you think we'd been able to form and come together as well?
I think it's a really good question, and I'll answer that as someone whose natural tendency is to take things slower and deeper. So completely the opposite of what happened then. And I think maybe that slowness might have been the problem if that had been more the case. So I definitely think we could have got to know each other in my usual approach. But to answer your question, would that have been as effective in that particular scenario? Probably not. That kind of brings me around to perhaps some of the issues I have with banter, which perhaps are more relevant after an event like that, where to then deconstruct, debrief, and sort of regroup and go, okay, what really happened there? I think you then have got to bring that slower, deeper form of communication in, if possible. And I think that's quite tricky to do when you've been on that sort of adrenalized, bantery. And we're using banter as a kind of shortcut for lots of quick, fast. If you talk about energies, and I don't mean male and female, but masculine energy type communication, I think it's quite hard to then slow down and reverse. So I do wonder if that is one of the problems with it.
Potentially, and I think there is the risk that there potentially comes to a point, and again that comes back to that non-official contract of where does it stop, and that is and I think another challenge with some banter as a general approach to social communication is that one person's stopping point is not the same as somebody else's, and one the line for everybody is written out in a different position, and because nobody will generally expressly state that, there is always that risk of that you will overstep the mark.
Yeah, and it could go the other way as well, can't it? I've just confessed to my preferred mode of communication, and in some ways you need consent for that too. Because certainly. I will often take people to places that are a little bit exposing in conversation, and that I guess there is a little bit more of a contract set up with that, but it's subtle. But you could argue that to do that to somebody without kind of pre-frame and consent is equally not right.
It's tricky, isn't it? And again, going back to I'm sorry to harp on about the WhatsApp group that we had, but I think if it hadn't been such a relaxed group, there were times when I was watching a stream that I wasn't what's the word?
Moderating.
Thank you. That I wasn't moderating, and there was an incident where somebody got disconnected. There was a technical issue, and without referring to the group, or I knew that I could have helped out and it would have gone down well. So I just jumped in, helped end a session, helped a speaker who was very stuck, bless her, and concluded that session. Now I worry that I'm just thinking out loud here that if we'd have had a more step back from that, what I would like to see is getting to know people on that bantery level, I might have felt, well, am I to do this? Am I going to tread on anybody's toes?
Bit of reticence.
Yeah, and who am I to help out? And I probably would have referred to the group, does anybody want me to help out with this, as opposed to got this. And there was so many times in that group where somebody would go, I've been disconnected, and somebody else was just straight in there, got you back, got this.
Yeah. And is this okay? Am I treading on your toes? Would I offend you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But again, I'm referring to my preferred communication style. So, and that's what, again, we come back to the sort of the N=1 situation of, not just therapy and mindfulness, but also, engagement and communication and having that flexibility.
Yeah. What do you think about the challenge that could be put forward, that banter at times is used to mask vulnerability, openness, really getting to the point?
Yeah, no, I think that's there are a couple of potential negatives of banter if it's not handled correctly, and one is that people like you said use it as a mask, and don't demonstrate their true nature, or potentially their own insecurities. I think we all, to an element, mask, and I think, Joe, one of your great skills is unpicking that a little bit, whether it's me or whether you're clashing great minds with Jack Chew. It's always interesting to watch. But I think it does help people. It helps people to deflect. I think it helps people. It can be used as a tool to deflect, for potentially good and for bad.
And that can be used positively, can't it? I mean, I'm sort of visualizing a duel going on, and let's use that as a metaphor for a conversation. If you have the agility to be vulnerable, but then just use banter briefly, almost as a kind of, you've taken me to a place that I'm a little bit too uncomfortable. Can we just step back up into banter world for a minute? Okay, I'll breathe again. Right, we'll go down again. And I think, if it's used like that, it can be a wonderful tool to actually keep a conversation going, rather than letting it go into the absolute cringe moment where you have to completely shut down because it's too exposing.
It's almost the release valve, isn't it, for some people, I believe. And that's why I really like watching the sort of the You Matter podcasts, and because I think one of your great skills is being able to take people to those places, but allow them to then sort of come up to the surface for air. I worry with banter that people see it as, and I know we're using analogies of sort of an engagement or a standoff, or whatever you want to call it. The language around it becomes quite combative, and that in of itself becomes a turn off for some people who potentially may be predisposed to not wanting to engage in that. Is that, well, can't we just get along? Why do we have to try and one-upman? Is the sort of the one-upmanship nature of it. And some people don't have the time, energy, or predisposition to want to engage in that.
Or the other side, which I would openly admit to, there's a kind of shadow side to me that is combative, and it comes out. Sometimes it's helpful, often it isn't. It isn't the side of me I desperately love. But sometimes I have to watch banter because I know that it will push me to that point. And I have to be okay with that and accept that is part of my personality. But I think sometimes it can bring out that side in people that you didn't think it was within.
Are you like the banter Hulk, Joe? Is that what it is? It's just in there simmering.
You will see it if you hang around me long enough. Ask my husband. How can I create a Twitter around that? Banter Hulk, fantastic. Let's bring that briefly back to your learning disabilities world in terms of so correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sorry if this is a really uninformed assumption, but I would assume that for some people that you come across, banter would be impossible just from an interaction cognitive perspective. Would that be fair?
Yeah, completely. I mean, one of my sort of raison d'etres for trying to improve standards amongst clinicians, or actually one of the primary drivers of that I see is improving clinicians' communication skills, but not just our expressive communication skills, but our perceptive skills. and being able to pick on whether or not somebody has any clue about what you're saying.
Right.
Now we see people who cannot eat, walk, talk for themselves. Some can't breathe for themselves. We also see people who have difficulties with social communication, and we also have people who are very good at masking due to anxieties, their social engagements, and their process is more of a, I want to get through this.
Right.
And so yeah, we have a good proportion of people for whom banter to the level that you may engage with friends and peers would not be that. Having said that, even with our guys who've got profound and multiple learning disabilities, slapstick humor and, getting them whacking you around the head is almost always a surefire way of getting some sort of response and engagement from that individual. And it could be seen to that level. We've got some people who will be wheeled into our gym, and I'll just go, get out, I don't want you here today, and their face will light up and they'll just be like, no, I'm not listening to you, and they'll come straight past me, and their therapist will be like, oh, don't listen to him, he's just stupid, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And for a lot of people, that's a really, really good way of engaging, and that's ways to make people feel comfortable, in spite of, if you took it at face value, well, the physio manager stood at the door and told the person to get out because we don't want them in here. It's a bit like, taken out of context, it becomes quite a, I could end up HCPC council. But it's a really, humor in of itself, I find, is a really useful tool, but only with the right person. And that's what comes down to being able to read the room and understand the individual that you're working with and be able to clarify understanding. If you are not checking, and as I said before, it's been interesting watching MSK services over the past sort of 7-8 years go, okay, maybe we should listen to maybe longer than that really, but we should listen to the patient more. We should talk about person-centeredness. We should adapt our communication styles. Maybe we should drop the I'm professional at all times facade and try and be human. And I'm sat here going, yeah, what have you been doing before? And I know because I've actually put up a poll on Twitter asking people, I've just unlocked the PC, is the use of humour and specifically banter more of, it was a cultural traits, that was what it was. Is it a male and a cultural trait? And then that sort of devolved into a conversation whether or not it was a barrier for people engaging. And funnily enough, Jem Oliver's been tagged quite a lot in the comments of that one. I think Jem probably out-bantered everybody.
On that particular
she probably won that particular WhatsApp group again. But
didn't you get some feedback from female colleagues when you put that?
Yeah, I did. So, I mean, actually, this conversation came from a chewing it over around the gender split for Therapy Live.
That's right.
Which was a while ago. Evie Martin was on there, and
Sue Julian.
Thank you very much for picking me up there, Sue Julian. And that was a really interesting conversation around the gender. And there was a sentence in there. It wasn't necessarily centered around banter, but there was a sentence in there that was relating about banter being a barrier for some people. And I work in the team that I work in. There are 3 men and 5 women, all of whom sort of set up like, oh, okay, but I don't feel like that. I don't feel that banter is an issue for me. And we had a bit of a chit chat around that as a group, of whether or not we are a self-selecting group, and therefore if we have a workplace culture that is happy to have playful banter with each other that doesn't exceed professional boundaries wherever we want to choose that they may be, that it's not a barrier. And does that workplace culture then attract people who are predisposed to engaging, predisposed to more banter in of themselves?
And do you mean specifically your work culture in learning disabilities, or in physiotherapy or healthcare in general?
Well, I mean, I was just speaking about my team specifically, but I know I've worked in a few teams over the years in various sectors, and I think within healthcare it's been seen quite a lot as it's been used quite heavily. I did spend a time before my university physio degree as a student nurse, and was lucky enough to do a placement on an accident emergency unit for a few weeks, and that was a real eye-opener. But a lot of people and the staff there coped through humor and playful banter. And I think when I started on there, you said you'll see that, you know, if you're working in A&E, you either get it or you don't. It's either for you or it's not.
Yeah.
And therefore, only the people who are potentially predisposed to live with that fast-paced, you know, highs and lows, and the culture of that, were the people who tended to be attracted to that or remain in that job. Other people generally went elsewhere. But for them, they certainly said that, you know, banter for them was a real, again, go back to that release valve from some of the things that they had to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I guess it's interesting, and it would be different for individuals whether banter is, as you say, purely a release valve, or whether there's also a flip side. So I think I used the term earlier in this conversation, a kind of adrenalized conversation. And for me, whilst I enjoy banter, it does feel adrenalized. And if I don't think that A&E scenario would be for me, because I think I would struggle to come out of that adrenalized state at the end of the day. And it would be too big a shift for me. But for some people that, I guess, that feeds, and others it takes away from. Yeah,
certainly. And I think just touch on another point you asked earlier on is, you know, the potential downsides of banter about people masking. But another one is, I think, is people who are using banter potentially using it as a mask for bullying. Is another thing that we need to consider. You know, where does bantering stop and bullying begin? And again, I think that comes back to that consent part of things, that unwritten contract. You know, I'm not clever enough to be able to pick apart the you know, the fundamentals of the social and human communication in all its great diversity. But, you know, everything we come back to continues to come back to, it's that playful, consensual engagement. And I think that might ultimately come back to personality types. Yeah,
and maybe even hide, dare I say it, intellectual ability in a conversation. You know, sometimes it's much easier, isn't it, to deflect with banter than to go, actually don't know.
I built a career on it, Joe. I built my whole career around it.
I got that fact from somewhere as well. Not you.
Citation unknown.
Yes, exactly. And n equals 1 again.
No, certainly. And I think so we do see that quite a lot within the people that we work with, not so much around the intellectual level, but people who may not be understanding or processing what's going on in the communication for the patients or the people that we work with. You can sometimes tell because they may be overly banterish and overly playful, and, you know, people are going to go, well, what the hell is he on about? What is that? And that's a tricky thing to define, which is why we need to take time to read the room and get to know individuals, so that then you can understand the deviation from the norm. And how I begin every sort of interaction with somebody is finding out, which is how, you know, when I do any training, I'm talking about communication and with patients, and I'm like, well, first, don't ask, you know, particularly people with learning disabilities, don't launch straight into your medical healthcare questions. Find something that's important to that individual, engage them on a level that they want to speak about. So if they're wearing a football shirt, a classic one, if they've got stickers on their wheelchairs, if they've got a rucksack, they've got, you know, whatever hairstyle or something that may indicate some personal preference that you can comment on, and then get that person to talk about that, because then what you'll be gaining is a baseline of them, and when they are probably at their best, because it's something that's their interest, you're demonstrating that you are taking an interest in them as a person. And for somebody with a learning disability particularly, but this is equally applicable to all areas of healthcare, you're putting them at ease.
Absolutely, which is our primary aim in any first interaction, isn't it?
Completely. So then you take that, and then you do that as it comes back to reading people, you are paying attention while they're talking about that, or while you're engaging them with that, so that then you can understand that as a baseline to perceive any deviation from in a normal communication. So if you're asking, if they're talking about West Ham or whatever, and they're talking quite eloquently and fluently, and you can ask them questions around that, and they give you straight answers. And all of a sudden, if you ask them something that they're not sure about, and all of a sudden they launch into, lots of jokes and japes or whatever, or go completely off topic, you can maybe go, okay, let's just drill down and check what you've understood by my question or from what we've said. So that's kind of how I think it's an important thing. And again, it just comes back to reading people and taking time.
And I know, we're both intellectualizing about something which a lot of people listening would, as you said, you thought yourself, I just do this naturally, and to over intellectualize it would kill the skill. But this reminds me of a conversation I had in the previous podcast with Helen Preston, who had, she was telling me about questions totally on a different level that she'd introduced in her subjective assessment, things like what brings you joy. And I'm starting to sort of visualize a whole new subjective assessment where there's questions like that, and then there's your kind of West Ham questions, and there's your slight ribbing questions, almost as a kind of, just put in a tidbit of each, see what response you get. And as you say, then you've got your barometer of what level do I work best at with this person and then with me.
Completely, is testing the waters. It really is, and that's a skill that isn't, I don't think, instilled well at undergraduate level. I think a lot of us have talked at length about the need for communication training to be more fundamental of healthcare. But particularly physiotherapy, when we understand that biopsychosocial factors, or particularly psychosocial factors, play such a big part in the perception of the biological. One other thing I would just mention is I did, so on that, just to close on the Twitter thread, is I had some response from somebody who we're going to remain anonymous, and they were just asking about Banter, and their perception was that Banter is actually ultimately very unprofessional. It's quite elitist, it's quite exclusionary, and it's something that they don't accept within their workplace
at all. So blanket.
That was what they were saying. And I do know this person, and I've met with this person a few times, and it was quite interesting to sort of hear that, because but then when I reflected on the engagements that I'd had with that individual, actually, Banter isn't something, it wasn't a tool that we'd used together, and it isn't necessarily a tool that I use or that this other person uses when engaging with me. And that's not something I'd consciously sort of clocked until that person, said, passed on their thoughts. They were also talking about the fact that they believed it was, that Twitter was, physio Twitter was predominantly a male culture, seemed to be a fairly male dominated culture. And whether or not people agree with that, certainly a lot of the people with higher followers seem to be male, and I think there's been some discussions around the implicit bias that people may have when they follow people. But so that, as a selection group, they wouldn't necessarily be representative of the wider healthcare sector, to be honest. So
and I would agree to an extent on that assessment of Twitter conversation. And I would admit that, at times, perhaps when I've been less thoughtful or a bit more lazy, I would adapt my communication style to fit the platform. Maybe that isn't lazy, maybe that's just, another form of what we've just said about, social interaction. But I actually think it's changing on Twitter, because I think a few people are being brave enough to mix it up, have the banter, and then sometimes thread in something a little bit more introspective. And maybe the thing is just to check yourself that you're not deviating too much from what actually is your core authentic, to use an overused word, authentic style of communication, accepting that you adapt, and we adapt all day and every day in our jobs, but not straying too far from you, because you and I actually reminded me of a conversation you and I have had about being chameleon in nature, and I think that sometimes is the danger in our jobs, isn't it? Not just as physiotherapists, but any clinicians listening. I've described myself as a chameleon many times through my career, and I just mean that ability to read and adapt. And I think there are occasions where you take that so far that you almost do forget what your default call was in the first place.
I agree with that. And I think, we've both spoken about the chameleon side of things. I think sometimes people can take it a little bit far, particularly when we're talking about the adaptation, and that, well, where does it become inauthentic? When is it not you engaging? When is it just an act? But ultimately, we are healthcare practitioners, and our job is to try and get the best outcome for the individual. And communication style is a tool that we can utilize for the benefit of the patient. In the same way that you can choose to do eccentric or concentric exercises or stretching. How I see it is, I am still me, and ultimately I'm trying to get the best for that person. And I think being able to be a chameleon, for want of a better phrase, is a skill set. And I think it's probably an underrated skill set, but one that carries a lot of weight for the individual. So I sort of reject people who sort of go, well, when if you're adapting to every single person that comes in, or you're not being yourself, but actually you're at work. And again, we go back to the sort of, what's work, what's professional, what's not professional, who are you? And that might necessarily not be for this debate right now, or this conversation right now, but I think it's part of it. And banter is a tool that we can put in that communication skill set, in the same way that, gaining that level understanding of what that individual engages like.
We're talking about professional identity, aren't we, really? And, I've covered that in the positive and the negative, that, it's a helpful thing to sort of contain yourself within, and sometimes it can be a difficult thing to break out of. Perhaps one of the key skills is having people in your life outside of work who you absolutely know, without any effort, you will be 100% you, and they're almost your homecoming people.
because being that chameleon is tiring, and it's something I took for granted until we had our first sort of cohort of university students through when I became a clinical educator. And after the first 2 weeks, that we had a weekly feedback, and one of the students just said, I am shattered. And I was like, okay, has it been heavy? Has there been a lot of moving and handling? Is it, that we're on a big campus? Has it been fit? And he was like, I'm not physically tired, but just having to adapt my style of communication to meet the needs of the people who are walking through the door, and being able to go from here to here in a second's notice has been mentally exhausting. Now, as this student came on placement, they adapted it and became more resilient towards that. But again, for me, I don't see, if we go back to when we were kids and you used to go and speak to your gran, you knew that you couldn't get away with the things that you'd say to a friend or a sibling. Exactly. Otherwise, as my gran reminded me up until their dying days, you're not too big for a smack bottom, sunshine. But I know I wouldn't engage with my grandma in the same way that I would engage with my peers. And that's no less of being a chameleon. Potentially it comes more naturally to us than in a clinical setting, but it's not to say that I am not myself. I am still me, but I'm just adapting myself to the environment.
Being a human being. Oh, thanks, Alistair. I think we've covered pros, cons, everything in between, and we seem to have come to a conclusion that having the ability to utilize banter selectively and appropriately is a good thing. But we are two of us with our particular views, and I think this would be I'd love it if people send in comments. If you've been sitting here screaming at not the screen, but screaming at your phone or whatever because Alistair and I are so biased in one direction, then give us your comments. I'd love to know what other people feel about this. Is there any area of banter, Alistair, that I haven't covered that you wanted to address?
No, I don't think so. I think we managed to sort of explore it all, and I think Joe and I, as you've just said, are pro banter within the correct settings, but we recognize that it is not a thing for everybody. I know people who are autistic, and it would be interesting to get the feedback from the autistic community who regularly talk about the challenges facing neurotypical communication. And so it would be really interesting to try and tag this out under the Asking Autistics hashtag, just to, because again, I'm sure there are people who are autistic out there that use banter and are absolutely fine. There are some who use it as a masking technique, and there's some people who may find it completely perplexing. So yeah, but I think it's important to highlight that whilst banter is good, it is a tool. It can be used inappropriately. It can be used to mask, and it can be used as a form of bullying. It's our responsibility to be mindful of those things and have that informal contract that's never spoken about, but develop a skill in drawing those up within your own head. And if that, maybe potentially that might take an initial conversation around, what's your preferred communication style, or are you okay with the jokes, and or I communicate in this way. If I say things that upset you, please let me know. I've got a couple of colleagues who sort of, when we get new people in the department, they say, I'm quite a jokey person, but if I say something that upsets you, please let me know, because I don't mean to. And that's kind of how they start their engagements. So it's interesting.
I think you've just done a fantastic roundup to the podcast, so I don't need to do it now. Thank you. Perfect conclusion.
Thank you, Jo.
I'm sure a lot of people listening will have also been very interested in your work, Alistair. So if people want to know more about what you do, how do they get hold of you, follow you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at the LD Physio. I'm on Instagram at _ the LD Physio _ on LinkedIn as Alistair Beverley. And I also have a website, which is fairly shiny new, and that's www.theldphysio.com, which is an information portal and hub for families and healthcare practitioners to try and improve your understanding. There's also some cheery blogs there from my childhood with my brother, with topics which are quite interesting. They sort of have a bit of a moral or learning point from them. But the times that John set me on fire is one. For example, the time that John saved me from a bully. So it's a reflection on my life and growing up with a brother who has a disability, and what I took from that, and hopefully the lessons that you can learn from that as well.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Yeah, do go and check that out, everybody. And Alistair, thank you so much for being my guest and bantering with me about banter.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed hearing us talk about banter without too much banter in the episode.